Okay, thanks very much. Firstly, thanks very much to Vivette. I'll introduce Vivette in a moment. Thanks very much to you for coming. Thanks very much to whoever managed to get the sandwiches here before the event rather than afterwards. So that always makes a big difference. So I'm delighted to welcome Vivette Glover, who's professor, I'll get the right title, Professor of Perinatal Psychobiology at Imperial College, and has worked a lot in the area of perinatal mental health, and certainly work that some of us have done here, particularly Ness has been leading recently. We've been able to benefit a huge amount from work that Vivette has done, and probably still doing. So we're going to hand over to you. I think you're probably going to sit down for the presentation, whatever.
Well,
you decide.
I'll start standing, and then if I feel I want to sit, I'll sit.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Over to you, and I'll leave you to introduce
Yes,
the
all
topic.
right. Thank you very, very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I've never actually spoken at LSE before, though my father was a student here many decades ago and used to speak with great affection of LSE, so it's a special pleasure to be here. So I'm going to be talking about the importance of perinatal mental health for child development. Perinatal means, it has different definitions, but it's usually, and I'll use it to mean pregnancy and the year following birth. I'll be particularly talking about the antenatal period, but both are equally important. So, depression is the most common major complication of pregnancy, and the theme that's going to run through this, which is probably something you've heard about before, is the neglect of mental health in the NHS. I mean, in general, maternity care in this country is very good, and if you have hypertension or diabetes or preeclampsia, you're likely to be very well looked after. But depression, which is the most common complication of pregnancy, is really neglected, and mental health in general. And this is important not just for the mother herself, it's really important for her, it's horrible to feel mentally ill, to feel depressed or anxious, but it's also important for the development of her child. And that's what I'm especially going to be talking about, because the mother's emotional state in pregnancy and in the early postnatal period can have a long-lasting effect on her child. And when I started working on this, I worked a lot with a brilliant professor of fetal medicine. He used to think that it was all a bit of old wives' tales. But the evidence in the last 15 years has got so strong that people don't think that anymore. This is from the cover of Time magazine, How the First 9 Months Shape the Rest of Your Life. It's a very good book by someone called Anne Murphy-Paul, who's a science journalist who's pregnant herself. And the first 9 months means pregnancy. It's not a new idea. This is a quote from Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who wrote Kubla Khan, and he said, "Yes, the history of man for the 9 months preceding his birth would probably be far more interesting and contain events of greater moment than all the 10 years that follow it." Well, that's a bit over the top. And I don't know why he said it, actually. It'd be really interesting to know why he said it. But he's on the right lines. And Leonardo said, "The things desired by the mother are often found impressed on the child that the mother carries." This idea of impressions is very widespread in a lot of societies, a lot of early primitive societies. So the whole idea isn't new. What's new is the science that shows there's something in it. And this is an educational poster from the States nearly 100 years ago. So don't listen to old wives' tales. No shock can mark an unborn baby. No horrible sight can deform him. But worry, fear and anger may affect his mother's blood, which supplies his food. Therefore, she should be calm, happy and sweet-tempered. That's the message of this talk. Easier said than done, I know. So, this is really the concept of fetal programming, which is that the environment in the womb during different sensitive periods with specific outcomes can alter the development of the fetus with a long-lasting effect on the child. And as I said, this used to be thought of as a way-out idea, but the evidence for it all becomes so strong in recent years. This is from the National Institute of Child Health in the States. Pregnancy and Perinatology Board, the strategic plan, says the programming hypothesis brings a new perspective to public health. Diseases that were once thought to arise near the time of their manifestation in adult life are now known to have roots in pre- and early postnatal life. And this really gives a different perspective on medicine and how we should intervene, public health policy and so on. A person who's done probably more than anyone else to put this idea on the map is David Barker. How many, just out of interest, have heard of David Barker and the Barker hypothesis? Just 2 of you. I mean, I don't know quite how to, it's something I'd be interested in, how to get ideas out there, because I mean, I sometimes talk to medical students and often they haven't heard of it either. This is a really important concept that ought to be changing how one thinks about medicine, and yet it hasn't got disseminated out. So this is David Barker, who sadly died last year, and he was an epidemiologist and a cardiologist, and he was interested in risk factors for cardiovascular disease, apart from the ones that are already known, like obesity and smoking and so on. And what he found was, these are 2, this is a slide from David Barker, these are 2 healthy full-term babies, but this one is twice as likely to die from cardiovascular disease in his 70s as that one. How you grow in the womb affects your vulnerability to cardiovascular disease later and other whole metabolic syndrome. So this was the original David Barker slide. He had birth weight data from Hertfordshire, where they kept very good records of birth weight, and then he looked at the mortality rates of people 70, 80 years later. And what he showed was that the lower the birth weight, the more likely they were to die of cardiovascular disease 70 years later. And it's linear across the range except for a bit of an upturn of very heavy babies. This is just risk factors. I mean, if you're low birth weight, there's no absolute, it's not deterministic, it's not sure that you're going to die of cardiovascular disease, but it increases the risk, it significantly increases the risk. Similar data for risk for type 2 diabetes. And there's been a lot of research following this up, and we now understand quite a lot about the mechanisms from animal models, human studies. If you're genetically programmed to be small, or you come from an ethnic group that is small, you're not at increased risk. But if you've grown less well in the womb than you were genetically destined to, you have fewer kidney cells, fewer pancreas cells, then you deal less well with all the environmental problems that come throughout life, high salt in the diet and so on. And that's what makes you vulnerable. So how the physical development in the womb can affect your vulnerability to cardiovascular disease and the metabolic syndrome in later life. And this has been shown in many, many studies around the world now. But more recently, Barker started reporting on this in the 80s. More recently, it's become clear that this is equally true for neurodevelopment, and this is what I'm going to talk about. And we've always known how we turn out depends on an interaction of our genes and our environment. But what we now realise that the environment starts in the womb, and it's equally important, it's important for how the brain develops. The environment in the womb that we get from our mother's blood affects the development of the fetal brain, affects the younger child, the older child, and actually lasts into adulthood. The fetal brain is under construction. It's incredible, 250,000 neurons a minute formed all through gestation, different things happening at different stages in gestation. The first 20 weeks the cells migrate to where they're finally going to be. At the second half of gestation, the synapses start to form, the pathways start to be laid down, receptors are created and so on. And how these neural pathways develop depends on the signals that the fetal brain is getting from the mother. There's actually neural pruning, more pathways are laid down than needed. The brain works on a use it or lose it sort of mechanism. And one of the factors that's particularly important in how the brain develops is the emotional state of the mother. And particularly if the mother is feeling stressed, anxious or depressed. And this has been a very important report, I think, from Lord Layard from here, nearly 10 years ago now, where he calculated that anxiety and depression are the single biggest cause of misery in our society. used to be poverty, and poverty obviously can contribute, but mental health is a major, so I'm going to keep repeating myself, public health issue. 40% all disabilities due to mental illness, and comorbid anxiety and depression are particularly common. You can get anxiety on its own. Depression on its own is actually less common. And women have as many symptoms of anxiety and depression during pregnancy as they have postnatally. How many of you knew that, just out of interest? Only 2 of you. I mean, again, I don't know. The media always talk about postnatal depression. I see the Labour Party is putting out, just said, I think yesterday, that they're going to give more funds for postnatal depression, which is really good. I'm delighted if they take any interest in perinatal mental illness at all. But prenatal depression, prenatal anxiety are as important as postnatal. And just, the media just don't seem to want to pick this up, and I don't know what we can do about it, because those of us in the subject have known this for a long time. Having a baby triggers psychosis, particularly bipolar, but that only affects about 1 in 500 women. This affects 10 to 20% of women. And pregnancy can also be a time of increased domestic abuse and relationship strain. So what are the long-term effects of prenatal stress on neurodevelopment? And stress is a difficult concept. I've been to lots of symposia and meetings where people discuss the definition of stress and then come up with definition maybe about homeostasis and then completely ignore it for the rest of the meeting. But I think it's an umbrella term. I think conceptually it's easier to think of it a lot of overlapping concepts. There isn't one single simple definition of stress, but all these things that may come under the umbrella of stress, the concept of stress, have been shown to be associated with altered child development. So symptoms of anxiety and depression, maternal daily hassles, pregnancy-specific anxiety, where women are particularly anxious about the outcome of their pregnancy, partner or family discord. The partner is particularly important in all those, and abusive partners shown to cause stress that affects fetal development. A supportive partner is very protective, and fathers are really important in all this from pregnancy. There's one study of the distress caused by the 6-Day War in Israel. It's a less well-designed study, but I think it's important because if we're thinking about the long-term effect of stress on pregnant women in the perinatal period, and we think what's going on in the world, in Syria and all sorts of horrors, we're not just affecting people now, we're affecting their children as well. And then there have been quite a few studies that have looked at the outcome for the child of women who are pregnant during some acute disaster, like a freezing ice storm in Canada, which doesn't sound so bad, but actually it was. This freezing ice storm, there was no electricity, women couldn't get out of the house, they couldn't go leave, it was cold, so it obviously was very stressful. And studies have shown those children have do less well cognitively. That's particularly what's been looked at. Outcome of children whose mothers were pregnant during a hurricane in Louisiana, and a lot of studies following up women who were pregnant in Manhattan during 9/11. And it's important for this to see that the data shows it's not just extreme or toxic stress or diagnosed mental illness that's associated with altered child outcome. This concept of toxic stress is quite common. It was raised by someone I really admire at Harvard, and I asked him why he used this term. And he said because in the States it's very hard to get across the idea that stress can be harmful. It's the general view, it's really rather good to be stressed, you know, we're not going to fuss about a bit of stress. And so he introduced the term toxic stress. But the evidence actually shows that there's a dose-response curve across the range, and this daily hassles. The evidence shows that really quite minor increased levels of either anxiety or depression or hassles can be associated with altered child outcome. So I've talked to him, and he agrees with this, but he just says that politically he finds it better to use this term toxic stress, which I... So, So prenatal stress, there have now been a lot of studies that have looked at the association. Each has a different design, and some of them have looked at the effects of an acute disaster like 9/11, some have looked at symptoms of anxiety and depression, have looked at the association between mother experiencing these in pregnancy and the outcome from the child. And it's clearly shown in a lot of studies that increased levels of symptoms of anxiety and depression in the child, increased levels of behavioural problems like ADHD, conduct disorder. It's increased risk of impaired cognitive development. Infants have more sleep problems. It's altered neonatal behaviour. It's harder to soothe babies, more difficult infant temperament. 2 studies have shown increase of victimisation in childhood. They're more likely to be bullied. Don't know exactly why, but probably because of a combination of a lot of all these other changes in the child. And there's some evidence, but not so strong, for increased risk of schizophrenia, increased risk of autism. There are also increased risk of physical changes. These, they're quoted more, reduced birth weight and gestational age, but on the whole you've needed much bigger studies to show that. They're smaller effects, they're definitely there, but there might be reduction of 200 grams in birth weight at a few days in gestational age. The increased risk of mixed-handedness, which in itself doesn't matter, but is associated with a whole lot of neurodevelopmental problems. We know it's set down in utero. It's an altered fingerprint pattern. There's a decreased telomere length. You know about telomeres? They're the bits at the end of DNA, which are protective, and it's shown that telomere length is associated with longevity. So it's possible that people have been exposed to stress in pregnancy, for some reason, maybe some of these other things, likely to live less long. There's increased risk of asthma, and there's altered immune function. So there's a wide range of different things that if the mother is stressed, anxious or depressed in pregnancy, the child is more likely to. These are only all risk factors. There's nothing inevitable about any of them. Different children are affected in different ways. But they're big social as well as a lot of problems for the individual child, the individual families, a lot of social implications in all this, because ADHD, conduct disorder, and cognitive problems are all strong risk factors for later criminal behaviour. So it's highly likely, as well as the effects on the individuals, we're affecting behaviour that affects has general social implications. So all these studies show very clearly an association between the mother's mood in pregnancy and altered child outcome. But is it causal? Well, that's much harder to show, because if the mother is stressed or anxious or depressed, she's likely to come from a poorer background, she's likely to smoke, she's likely to drink, she's likely to be depressed postnatally, it's likely to affect her parenting. There's a host of confounders. But we have tried hard to address this. I should say that a lot of animal studies have been going on from the 50s, have shown that if you stress a pregnant rat or a pregnant monkey, and you say you cross-foster on day 1, so there aren't any postnatal effects and they're not smoking or drinking, you get a whole lot of these alterations. So certainly this phenomenon is clearly established in animal models. But in humans, we've tried to address the problem of confounders using the large LSEHSC cohort to determine the long-term effects of prenatal depression and anxiety on the behavioural development of the child, allowing for all the confounders. LSEHSC is a population study started by someone called Jean Golding in the early 90s. It's really all her initiative. It's a large prospective birth cohort, so there have been a lot of birth cohorts, but this is the only one that started in pregnancy. And so she has a lot of data, they collected a lot of data from all these women and their partners during pregnancy and following the children up in all sorts of different physical, emotional, behavioural ways. I'm going to report on the analysis we've done till the children are 13. We decided at the beginning we'd compare the outcome for the children of the 15% most anxious or depressed women and the rest. So this isn't anything very extreme or abnormal. And we've Child outcome, we use something called the Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, which the mother had filled up when the child was 13, which has 3 dimensions of ADHD, anxiety and depression, and conduct disorder. But what's so good about LSEHSC is they have data on all the confounders really that we want to look at, including maternal, postnatal anxiety and depression, paternal, pre- and postnatal anxiety and depression, because of course there's continuity. If the mother's anxious and her child is anxious, maybe it's all just genetic. But if it's all just genetic, you'd expect equally strong effects from the father and the mother, and you certainly don't. You get slight associations with the father, but they're much stronger with the mother. We have data on postnatal parenting, maternal age, birth weight, gestational age, smoking, alcohol, SES, maternal education. And all these do have an impact on child outcome, but we wanted to establish that the prenatal associations we were seeing were independent of all these confounders. And this study with complete data is big enough that we have the power to look for all those confounders. And what we found indeed is that there is a significant and persisting effect, that if the child is in the top 15, the mother was in the top 15% for either anxiety and depression, with very similar patterns, while she was pregnant. This is the trajectory for the child's total score, compared significantly more than if the mother was in the bottom 85%, after allowing for all these confounders. And in this study we also compared the effects of prenatal and early postnatal anxiety and depression, because it's been known for a long time that postnatal depression also has an effect on child development. That's been known for a very long time by different mechanisms, psychological mechanisms. But what we found was if we compared pre and post separately, they had rather similar degrees of magnitude of effect on the child. So this is if the mother wasn't anxious pre or postnatally. This is pre and not post, that's post and not pre, and that's both. They're additive. So prenatal anxiety or prenatal depression and postnatal depression both have an effect on child outcome derived from all these confounders, and they seem to be additive. And one can convert the SDQ score into probable mental disorder, and the likelihood of that these scores are actually reflecting a mental disorder. If you look at age 13, the mother was in the bottom 85% for anxiety, but it's similar to depression. The child has about a 6% risk of a probable mental disorder. If she was in the top 15% after allowing for the confounders, it's about 12-13%. So the risk is about double. So this is clinically very significant. It's important in terms of public health, but it's important to realise that most children aren't affected. There's still 90% of the children, nearly 90%, aren't affected by this in this way. Children are affected in different ways. So links are similar with prenatal. That was at 32 weeks, but similar at 18, and probably slightly different mechanisms going on. Links are similar with depression, but it's clearly not all happening in the first trimester. And that's important when one starts to think about intervention, because women often only come to their GP, or only find them when they come at booking, the end of the first trimester. And if that was too late to intervene, because everything had already happened, that would be a pity, but it's certainly not so. Something like the fetal alcohol syndrome or thalidomide, if major effects occur in the first trimester, because that's when the physical structure of the fetus is being developed. So the limbs or the shape of the face, they're laid down in the first trimester, but the brain goes on developing all through gestation and postnatally. So just to summarise, the top 15% of the most anxious or depressed women, the rate of probable mental disorder is doubled after allowing from all the confounders we can think of. And from this we can calculate the attributable rate of probable mental disorder in the whole population due to prenatal anxiety, depression or stress, about 10 to 15%. And there are a lot of other factors. Postnatal matters equally. genetics matters. But this is a sizable proportion. But it raises the question of why are some children affected and not others? Why are they affected in different ways? And we thought it was highly likely there's a gene-environment interaction. That if the child has a particular genetic vulnerability to something and the mother is anxious or depressed in pregnancy, they'll develop, say, ADHD. If they have a genetic vulnerability to asthma, they may develop asthma. So we just started to look at that with the LSEHSC cohort. We started looking at a gene called COMT, which metabolizes noradrenaline and dopamine. And it's known that different genetic variants of this gene are associated with cognitive outcome. So with LSEHSC, they'd done a working memory test at age 8 with these children, called backward digit span. So you say to the child 842, and they have to say whatever the backward 842 248. That's 3, and then they go on to 4, which I'm not going to even try. I'm not very good at this myself. You can see the mean. I don't think it's because of stress in pregnancy, it's because of old age. The mean is 3.5. But if the child has, so the colours have gone on this, but if the child has the GG form of this gene and the mother was anxious during pregnancy, they do significantly worse in this backward digit span. If the child has either of the other two forms of this gene, they're not affected. Is that clear? So it's a clear example of gene-environment interaction. And I think this is just scratching the surface of what this is going to be like. We now know there are about 120, at least 120 genes involved in predisposition to schizophrenia, for example. All genetic vulnerability to these neurodevelopmental problems are very complex. Lots of different genes, each have a little effect. But this is probably explaining why some children are vulnerable to one thing and not another. And they're vulnerable to different things, and we all are. And that same gene also makes the child more vulnerable to ADHD, so it's diagnostic interview at age 15, and it's that same form. And there's not a nil effect if they have the other two forms, but it's much stronger with that form. So we're just scratching the surface and beginning to understand why some children are vulnerable in one way, some in another, why some children are affected and not others. Sometimes people say, like, poverty can't explain this. I grew up in poverty and I'm fine. And it's so, I mean, I'm sure none of you would think that, but I mean, that's so complex. I think another thing we need to educate the public about is multifactorial causes. And among the multifactorial causes is particular specific genetic vulnerabilities. So what might be the underlying mechanisms of how the mother's emotional state in pregnancy affects child outcome? There's a lot of work going on epigenetic modifications. A lot of the animal studies with prenatal stress are showing epigenetic changes in the brain. That's changes to the, not to the underlying gene sequence, but to the modifications to the genome, which affect how much the gene is turned on or off, specific genes. Important aspect of epigenetic studies is showing they can affect, the effects can carry on to the grandchild generation, and they seem to wear off. So things that are changed via epigenetics could persist, say in Syria, not just to the children, but the next generation. There's a lot of work on how to reverse epigenetic changes, and that's just starting. There's a lot, more people are just beginning. No one knows really how to target specific epigenetic changes, because if you give some drug, you can change epigenetic modifications, being changed right through the body. So we've been wondering about, based on the animal work, our hypothesis would be that maternal stress, anxiety, and mental illness would cause an increase in cortisol, which is the main stress hormone. Enough of this would cross the placenta to affect the development of the fetal brain. But all this needs to be worked out in humans. The first bit, in humans, in pregnancy, the whole system of the body that makes cortisol is changed, And there's a rather buffered effect on cortisol, so it might contribute, but I don't think it's very strong. We're interested in the function of the placenta, because if one's concerned about what's changing the development of the fetal brain, the chemicals will come from the mother via the placenta. And we now know that the placenta is actually a very sensitive organ, that it's very sensitive to signals it's getting from the mother, and it changes its filtering capacity. So the fetus and the placenta are really one unit. Placenta is where we first looked at this enzyme that breaks down cortisol, which is very rich in the placenta. And we recruited women having an elective caesarean. We asked them how anxious and depressed they were. We collected the placenta and we looked at the expression of this enzyme, and we found that the more anxious they were, the less there was of this enzyme. This is also something that's been found in animals, but this is the first study in humans. Clearly needs repeating. We're just beginning to scratch the surface of understanding this, but it makes it all a bit less mysterious to see the sorts of mechanisms that may be going on. So what we think might be happening, though, as I say, I think one should, well, this is a pilot study, it needs repeating, and there's other people getting interested in the function of the placenta, that if the mother is stressed, anxious, depressed, the level of this barrier inside the placenta goes down and would allow more cortisol to cross to the fetus. So this is, as I say, I think you have to be a bit cautious about this result, but it's a sort of thing that we think is probably happening. And does it matter if the fetus is exposed to more cortisol in the womb? Well, we've done another experiment where we've recruited women who are having amniocentesis, and they take more amniotic fluid than they need and throw away the extra, but we've taken the extra, we can measure cortisol. So we can measure the amount of cortisol fetus is exposed to in the womb. We've brought the children back when the child's about 18 months. And here in this study we're particularly looking at cognitive development, so we can do a baby IQ test, something called the Baileys. They have to point at the pig or the apple, or put, you know, these posting boxes where you have to sort of push a triangle through a space, that sort of thing. It's the best baby IQ test. And we found the more cortisol they're exposed to in the womb, the worse the baby did in this baby IQ test. And we also studied how securely attached they were to the mother. And we found that if they were securely attached, it completely buffered this effect, the exposure to cortisol in the womb. If they were insecurely attached, it was very strong. So this reinforces, and we also now with colleagues at the Institute of Psychiatry are looking at the MRI of these same children who are now aged 6 to 9 and finding changes in particular parts of the brain. They've just looked, this is the first thing they've looked at, which is the pathway to do with attention. So it may explain why they have problems with attention and ADHD as well. So the more cortisol exposed in the womb, the more difference there was in the fMRI of this particular system. So higher in utero exposure to cortisol is associated with lower cognitive function, and I could say with changes in the brain associated with attention. But sensitive early mothering can reverse the effects, at least in terms of cognitive development, of high in utero exposure to cortisol. This also is complex. The sensitive mothering didn't reverse all the effects we saw. But things are certainly not all over at birth. It's a continuity between what happens in the womb, what happens postnatally. The brain continues to be plastic, but it's particularly plastic at the very beginning. But sensitive early mothering can help attachment, and depressed mothers, of course, can have problems with their interactions with their babies. And that's well known that mothers who are depressed often don't make good eye contact, don't interact in a sensitive way with their baby. They look away, or they're over-intrusive and sort of poke them. They don't do so well, they don't have a good attachment bond. So pre and post are both important. I've been interested in why all this might be happening, and why does all this stress, the mother's feeling stressed, anxious, depressed, does it have this effect on her child? And I think one can start to, and this is obviously very speculative, start to think of what the evolutionary mechanisms might be, what the evolutionary reasons might be. I think in a primitive environment, for our ancestors, if their mother was feeling stressed, it was probably because could often be because there was real danger about, and we're feeling stressed for financial reasons or all sorts of things. But if you actually imagine that there might be a snake or some hostile tribes or something nearby, then it could be very adaptive to have some of these features that we see in the children. So particularly anxiety, fear reactivity. Anxiety is very associated with increased vigilance and scanning. So if you're more anxious, you're going to be looking all the time around. You're more likely to pick up some danger. Readily distracted attention. If you hear a rustle in the undergrowth, again, it can be adaptive to pay attention to that. And here, it's maladaptive if you're distracted by some builder outside the window. But in a genuine danger, it can be adaptive to have these features. Impulsive, another feature of ADHD, it might be adaptive to go and explore new environments. Conduct disorder, they're more willing to break rules. Aggression, which is quite a big part of conduct disorder, you can see that sort of lashing out quickly. If there's a snake there or some danger, could be protective in evolutionary terms. That's not at all for us. Cognitive deficits are harder to explain in themselves, but they can be a side effect of lack of attention. Or in Asperger's, it can be helpful for some members of the community to understand things in different ways. Sex differences, I haven't gone into this, but in the animal models, females are more likely to be anxious, and you can see that it might help for females who stay and look after their offspring to be the vigilant ones. The males who go out and explore, it's more adaptive for them to be aggressive, lash out. So it can explain some of the sex differences in these things. It can explain the dose-response curve, that if there's more danger, it's more helpful to have more people responding like this. And children aren't all affected in the same way. It's absolutely fundamental to the whole Darwinian explanation of things. It's good to have different people responding in different ways. So, what should be done about all this in 5 minutes? This is based on an analysis of data from here, Australia and the USA, that out of 100 cases of perinatal depression, only about 40 are recognised clinically, only about 24% get any treatment, and only about 10% get adequate treatment. So, in the Western developed world, the care for perinatal mental health is terrible. These are quotes from a PhD I examined last year. The emphasis of maternity services was 98% medical, physical thing, 2% emotional, and said they're more interested in you medically. If you've got any lumps and bumps and pain, they're not asking how you're feeling at the moment. Are you coping? So I think we can all help to support pregnant women more. Fathers have a particularly important role in being supportive, but employers can be more sensitive to these issues. And also, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't work. I sometimes talked about this, and the Daily Mail said, research shows women shouldn't work in pregnancy, which is not something I've ever said. But I think there could be more sensitivity to what women want to do, what's suitable for them to do, to give women individual choice. Grandparents have a role to play, friends, there should be education in schools. Women can help themselves, different women find different things helpful. Relaxing in different ways, yoga, massage, music. But professionals, I suppose, is where we can act most. That there's got to be, midwives and health visitors are sympathetic to this, having a harder job with obstetricians, but they'd like to do it, but they don't have time. It's just starting to be more attention, but we know what should be done to treat anxiety and depression. There can be psychological interventions for most people. More severe end, there should be pharmacological. We know that most drugs are safe, antidepressants. If need to help with relationship problems or domestic abuse if that's a problem. We need to help create more social support, practical help with housing and so on. We know that people who don't have a home to go to can be very stressful. And then for the postnatal period, help to teach sensitive mothering, video feedback. And then there's the report that's come from here, which I hope and should be highly influential, the costs of perinatal mental health problems, which hit the headlines of The Guardian, which was very good, because it showed that the key points of the programme are that it costs $8 billion to neglect mental health problems, and of those costs, 28% relate to the mother and 72% to the child. That's what's particularly new about this report. They've included the cost down the line of the effects on the child. So that, and that they, if one intervened, it would cost only a fifth of the cost of what neglect is costing. So that there's an overwhelming case, economically as well as everything else, for early intervention. We could help to prevent a lot of all these problems. And I think that's the single biggest reason why we've got to try and get more money into services. Of course it matters that we could save money, but more than 1 million children in the UK suffer from neurodevelopmental disorders of the sort that the rate is increased by perinatal maternal mental health problems. The attributable load of, this attributable load thing, some of my colleagues actually think that we don't have enough to go on, but I'd just like to get a sort of ballpark figure, so you can criticise that, but I think it's roughly of the order of 10 to 15%, maybe if you include pre and post. But that means that there's a potential to reduce the number of affected children in the UK by 100,000 to 150,000. Whatever the figures exactly are, it's something in this ballpark. So it's incredibly important. We'll save money, but we'll also save a lot of misery. And if you're interested in this, I have a website called Begin Before Birth, which has lots more about all this. So thank you.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Vivette. I'll throw it open to comments or questions.
Extremely interesting. I have 3 questions for you. The first is, have you looked at the Dutch cohort? What happened to them?
Shall I answer one at a time? Yes. I haven't looked at it, but many people have. This was the Dutch winter famine that in the Second World War the Germans cut off cities in Holland, and the women didn't have enough food and were highly stressed. And these women, their children, grandchildren now have been followed up, and there are a lot of effects. There's more schizophrenia, more behavioural problems, and the epigenetic changes, and they're being followed through and showing that they're affecting the grandchild generation. Yes, it's highly relevant. I didn't go into all the different studies, but that's a very good one.
The second question is, in your second question is, have you looked at the changes that have occurred in perinatal care or antenatal care? 50 years ago, when I was young, antenatal care was quite different to what it is now, and there was very much more concern with the mental well-being. Have you shown a change in the frequency of neurodevelopmental contacts in children born 50 years ago compared to those born now?
Well, again, I haven't looked at that. Mike Rutter has looked at the change in the level of child mental health problems and has found that they've gone up. And no one really knows why this is. No one's related it to the quality of perinatal mental health care, as far as I know. I find it quite startling in a way that the generation that were born in the Second World War have fewer mental health problems than young children now. If one thinks of the stress that's going on then. So there's quite a lot of questions to be asked, and it's a very good question, but I don't think we know. I think the evidence is good. It's not just increased diagnosis, that there are more mental health problems in children now. far as I can, it's not something I've looked at myself, but as far as I can tell from reading what other people are saying. But I don't think we know why.
My third question is, in your outback cohort, you only looked at 7,000 out of 14,000. How did you choose the 7,000?
Oh no, that wasn't a matter of choice, that says with complete data. Because though there was 14,000 originally, and there were various dropouts and incomplete data, so that was the cohort that we had complete data. I mean, we looked at the attrition, and they weren't very different in, as far as we could see, the ones who were...
If they dropped out,
or they didn't have fully, they didn't fill in about their smoking or whatever.
You don't think they were selected?
Well, they weren't selected by the researchers. There was incomplete data.
No, obviously by the researchers.
No.
You don't think that the 7,000 which you included were a select cohort?
Well, in a sense they were, but we have looked at the features that we can look at. Well, we have data on both, and they weren't really very different. And it's always a question with attrition, why there's attrition. Depressed people tend to drop out of studies more, and so on. And we might have an underrepresentation of depression. But as far as we could see, it wasn't accounted for anything. We have looked at the equality, what was going on in those we didn't have complete data. Yeah.
Other questions or comments?
Yeah.
Have you looked at the relationship between perinatal, antenatal mental health and birth events?
Birth events, right. We haven't looked at that, and that's a good question. And there is some evidence that there's more likely to be birth problems, more cesareans. They're more likely to obese, which we didn't know much, but I was just reading someone else's study on obesity, and then obese women. There's obese women are more likely to be anxious and depressed. They're also more likely to have cesareans and have traumatic deliveries and so on. So,
because that would be a
we had an include in our study. We had impact on the birth rate, which was a kind of male, like the strongest relationship we found. But there are others that said like cesareans, and there's lots of evidence on that link, not all confirming that there is one, but most.
That would be another mechanism.
Yes. Well, we looked at, and we certainly looked at whether covariation, we had cesarean versus vaginal, making a difference. And we've tried to think about all these things that we can. We haven't focused on mechanisms of birth particularly. I think it's actually very likely to be a mediating mechanism, but we haven't looked at it enough. And it's a good point, it's a highly relevant question. It's PTSD as well. Some mothers traumatised by it. That hasn't been studied much.
Okay, other comments or questions?
Just wondered what your thoughts were on mother and baby units for mothers who are very badly ill. So I think there was a study that came out a few years ago from the Healthcare Commission which found there was a shortage of them. I don't know if that's still the case.
No, absolutely true, there is. There's a terrific place called Lottery. The Maternal Mental Health Alliance, which was behind the economic report, has also produced a map. If you look at their website, they have a map of where mother and baby units are, whether there's a proper pathway of care for people with perinatal mental illness. In some areas, so code green, are excellent, and some are red, where there's nothing. So there's huge variety. And we've just got to get the whole country green. And Wales have just shut their only mother and baby unit. So there's some places excellent, some places it's nil.
I think it's a good one.
And of course it should be good, although it's really important that there should be proper mother and baby units, because otherwise the mother and baby are separated, the mother has to go to other wards, and the mother and baby units are very excellent for looking after women with this severe mental health problems. Yeah.
Is there an effect of having an older sibling? So you can imagine that mothers are more stressed when the second child comes around.
We put parameters, I didn't put all these things in because we didn't find any effect on and whether they have. I mean, actually, I got more relaxed, I think. You really know what you're doing. I think it can vary. But we have looked at that actually in all our studies. We put that in as a variable. We haven't found it as an effect. But it's highly relevant. It could have been.
Okay, further comments or questions? I'm just trying to work out who in the room. There's a few that are young enough to analyse the LSEHSC data at age 70.
That would be
interesting.
great, wouldn't it?
So
Yes,
2060
absolutely.
is when you've got to write your proposal.
Yes,
like
yes, yes.
No, you're not. But I think, but actually, it's interesting that the effect is quite marked through those years. So.
Yeah, well, the Dutch famine people are following it right through. They are following it right through.
Okay, any other comments or questions?
Quick question.
Yeah.
You mentioned a Dutch famine,
Yes.
and I used to work for a similar study. So where
You
we
used
did
to what?
a similar study in Barbados where we did
Barbados?
undernutrition and followed them up over 40 or 50 years. And we found, obviously, basically the same set of outcomes that you found in the kids that were undernourished as infants. And obviously that might be comorbid with maternal stress. I mean, it seems like it could
Yes.
be.
Yes.
Is there any scope for analysing like whether those are interacting or sort of
Mothers
confounding? So say if a mother is very stressed, she may not feed the child properly. Is that been looked at?
I think that's been looked at. And yes, the Dutch, and the famine was such a severe stress. They found they had to have under 1,000 calories for it to be having an effect. So just a bit of undernourishment doesn't seem to matter. It doesn't affect birth weight anyway. You have to get really severe undernourishment to affect birth weight. I think I actually heard someone talk about that Barbados study. But I don't know that anyone's distinguished those things. I mean, it's certainly true.
Okay, any other comments or questions? I got one comment from my daughter. Actually, my daughter, who became a mother 5 months ago, she works as a child protection social worker, so when she heard about the seminar, she can't be here, but it's a question which is slightly bizarre, but somebody from one of her, in her birth group said that the placenta, eating the placenta is actually a protective factor. And in fact, there are recipes, and the one I think was discussing is placenta smoothie. I have to say, that's grossed me out. But actually, you know, again, this goes back to the evolutionary thing. I mean, is there anything in that? Is there any?
Well,
it's a serious question, but I find it amusing.
Well, yeah, I mean, the placenta is very rich in iron, and especially if you need more meat. I don't think it's any different from eating liver. There's all these enzymes and things. No exercise.
No.
Cooking.
I wasn't having a dinner.
There's no evidence that eating the placenta helps.
Okay.
But I mean, I don't know. There's no evidence it does. There's not much evidence that it works.
Okay, all right. I think we'll stop there. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you very much, Vivette, for stimulating the presentations. Let's thank Vivette again.